Hello there everyone, you've tuned in UXW Bill yet again, and believe it or not, as you can see, I'm going to take the opportunity while making this video to talk about yet another computer. I know it must seem hard to believe given all the talking about computers that I did in my last video, as well as the ranting that I got into. It must be some kind of a sickness, that's all I can say. But I do enjoy talking about computers, and I think that most of you enjoy watching my computer-themed videos, if the viewership numbers are anything to go by, and so I figure that most of you will probably indulge me for what should be a much shorter, sweeter, and more to the point, plus blessedly free of, well, too much ranting at least, video about a computer system. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that right now as I'm making this video, I have a cold. And the cold started out as one of these things that gets up in your sinuses and makes you unable to smell stuff and to sniffle and hack and snort all the time, but now it's kind of turned into a cough sort of a thing. I really thought I was getting over it, but unfortunately that does not appear to be the case. Hopefully I will not dissolve into a coughing fit on the video. Amazingly, I don't even sound all that abnormal. I didn't even sound too abnormal when I was all stopped up. But that's not the subject of this video. Nope, this computer is. This is a computer that I found at the only thrift store in my part of the world that's actually willing to sell computers. And to give you an idea of how few computers they actually get, at least the ones that I'm aware of, the last time I saw a computer offered for sale in there was the time that I bought and made a video about the Compaq Desk Pro Pentium 2 system. So unfortunately, although they are willing to sell computers, they just don't show up very often. Have you ever gone into a thrift store and saw something that you wanted only to discover that to get the one part of it you were really interested in, you'd have to buy everything? Well, such was the case with this computer. This was a complete outfit featuring a high-tech Microsoft mouse with no rubber ball in it. Although it did still have the keeper. I don't know, maybe someone was missing their mouse ball and felt a great compulsion to steal one from the thrift store. It always amazes me, the stuff that people steal from thrift stores or the way they break equipment apart, but I know I've ranted about that before, and again, it's not really the point of this video. In addition to this computer system, there was also a 15-inch CRT monitor that had seen some better days by a long shot. It was very badly yellowed, the side plastics were all cracked and broken, and the front panel door over the controls was missing. So, although I had to buy everything, the computer, the mouse, the monitor, the keyboard, even the power cords, the whole schmear set me back about $7, and I later went and unloaded the monitor at the Goodwill. Now, I do want to point out that if a CRT monitor is in good working order, I will keep it, because there are certain applications that I do prefer CRT monitors for, and even though they were produced in great numbers, as many of them have gone off to the recycling as they have, their numbers are getting rarer, and so I hang on to any CRT monitor that is in reasonable physical condition and good functional condition. But unfortunately, this one was not doing very well on either count, and since I had to take it, I figured that maybe somebody else could get some benefit out of it. It did work, but I went ahead and unloaded it at the Goodwill because the focus was a little blurry on the picture. The colors were off enough to suggest that the tube had probably done a lot of hours, and as previously mentioned, the cabinet was not in the best of shape. It's the keyboard that made me want to buy this whole computer setup, and unfortunately, as previously mentioned, they would not sell it separately. So what kind of a keyboard did I get? Obviously, it must be something special. Well, it certainly is. Apparently, the previous owner of this computer appreciated the finer things about high-quality keyboards, and so they held on to this. This is a Dell AT101W keyboard. This is yet another tactile response keyboard. It is based upon Alps switches. Complicated white switches, I believe, is the name for them. I know that the word complicated shows up in the name somewhere, and that's about as well as my little old brain can manage to do, because it's already out of space, having stored countless eons worth of useless trivia pertaining to computers and electronics. So if I've got it wrong, by all means feel free to correct me in the comments, but as always, please be gentle. This keyboard, as far as the tactile response goes, I would liken it to something that uses Cherry Blue MX switches in terms of sound and feel. It's certainly a lot quieter than the IBM Model M, and so if you want a tactile keyboard but someone in your home raises an objection to the amount of noise that something like a Model M makes, this keyboard, or one based on Cherry MX Blues, might be just the perfect thing for you, because it still has a tactile response, but it's much quieter. Using a computer that you're not supposed to be using with a Model M keyboard attached to it is nearly impossible because of the racket. You can't actuate the keys on one of those quietly no matter how hard you try. But in the case of this Dell keyboard, you can if you work them gently and don't push them in a rapid fashion. But if you type on it normally, which I'll try to capture a sample of my doing a little later on in this video, it's got quite a nice sound and a feel to it without being deafeningly loud. As I said previously, this is the first one of these that I have ever come across. This is a fairly late model unit because it has the 104 key layout with the Windows keys, which you can use under other operating systems. And I'm pretty impressed with it. I think this keyboard is going to be a keeper, and for the $7 that I paid for the whole setup, I think I got a heck of a deal, even though I was really only interested in the keyboard itself. We'll go ahead and look at the information plate here on the bottom. You can see the model number on the keyboard. You might even be able to derive a date of manufacture by looking at the serial number. I would say sometime around the mid-1990s, because during that time a fair number of computer manufacturers still actually cared about the quality of the keyboards they were including with their computers, and even if they included a rubber dome mush board as standard issue, they would sometimes offer you the option for a better quality keyboard. And I know that at one point Dell actually sold, and I would love to find one of these, rebadged Model M keyboards that actually have the Dell logo on them. But in the meantime, this is truly an excellent keyboard. I'll go ahead and touch some of the keys here so you can get an idea of the sound that it makes when you type on it. Alright, so that pretty well covers the keyboard. It's in good working order. It's clean. I kept the computer. I brought it out here to make part of the video about it. So what about the computer? On the face of it, this is just another fairly late 1990s era mini tower personal computer, like so many others of the time. There's really nothing very exciting about it. In fact, this was obviously something of a budget-oriented model, since as you can see, it was originally equipped with the Intel Celeron processor. I believe that Gateway offered these machines with full-fledged Pentium 3, and there might well have been an AMD version of this as well, because I know that at the time Gateway offered machines based on both companies' processors. This is the model 400C, which would tell me that it has a 400 megahertz clocked Celeron processor. It would have shipped originally with Windows NT or Windows 98. And just an interesting little sidebar here, on the side of the case cover was taped this little note containing a Windows product key. Now, I don't know what version of Windows it might be that's running on this thing. I'd be very surprised if it's not Windows 98. I'd be very surprised if it was Windows NT, because I would imagine anyone who ordered one of these computers running Windows NT probably would have opted for a more powerful processor than the Celeron. Though I have to admit, I have a soft spot for the Intel Celeron processor. I've always thought that throughout its various incarnations, whatever processor it was based upon, that the Celeron was almost always excellent value for money, especially in the earlier days. I know a lot of people look down upon the Celeron, and I never did. Another feature installed in this computer that I suspect was installed much later in its life is a compact disc burner. That alone is also well worth about $7, although these days a lot of people like DVD burners in their computers if they have an optical drive at all, and some well-heeled folks even have a Blu-ray burner, or at least a reader of some kind, in their computer. But I still find a lot of utility even from a simple CD burner such as this. The CD-ROM drive below it is definitely the original Gateway issue, and down here, of course, we have something that, you know the saying, all real computers have floppy drives, and this one is no exception. I was talking about this computer with NJ Roadfan, and he mentioned that sometimes these power buttons were very prone to breakage. I can't say as I've ever seen one that was broken, but this one seems to be in good working shape. We have the hard drive LED, we have the power light, the Gateway logo, of course. I'm old school. You'll probably hear me call them Gateway 2000 at least once. And then over here we have something that you don't often see, at least on name brand computers any longer, and that's a reset button. If you're feeling charitable, the reason you don't see a reset button on modern computers has to do with the greatly increased reliability of the operating system. If you're not feeling so charitable, you can say that it's penny pinching at its finest. Now, looking inside this computer, we have a nice little motherboard in here. Despite its budget stature, it's a reasonably well-made board. I'd say it was probably built by Intel for Gateway, because this was in an era when the computer manufacturers, in order to better compete on price and to save money on research and development costs, would oftentimes farm out the motherboard manufacturer to someone else. We have a tiny little power supply here, manufactured by Aztec Custom Power. This is a 90-watt power supply, and probably with something of a following wind. The date of manufacture on that is 9909, so probably the 9th week of 1999. Could be the 9th month, but usually that's the year and the week. We'll go ahead and take a look at some of the fixtures on the motherboard here. Most likely this thing is using an Intel 810 chipset, which was something that Intel actually came out with rather hastily. You see, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, Intel was eager to tell everyone that they were going to buy RDRAM, and what's more, they would like it. Well, people didn't like it, and the Taiwanese chipset manufacturers like SIS, VIA, Acer Labs Incorporated, probably a few others that I've forgotten as well, all happily jumped into the ring to bring Pentium 3 and AMD-capable chipsets. I don't know that there was ever an AMD system that used RDRAM, come to think of it. But Intel was definitely hooked on it, and the Taiwanese chipset manufacturers were all too happy to cater to the demands of the marketplace, and so they produced much less expensive chipsets that used the much cheaper, much more readily available, and less associated with a nasty company SDRAM modules instead of RAM bus. And so they really started to eat Intel's lunch in a big way. Intel's response was to develop the 810 and 815 chipsets. And as we all know, eventually RAM bus just kind of fell by the side. And these days, although the RAM bus company still exists, they are nothing more than a patent troll. We have 3 PCI slots here, no AGP slot for dedicated graphics, although maybe a higher end model would have offered one, since as you can see there is an extra slot blank here that will never be used. There's a telephone modem, looks to be made by US Robotics, so probably pretty decent quality. Most likely it's a WIN modem, but unlike the other WIN modems of the time, the US Robotics ones were actually pretty good. I don't remember having too much trouble with them. This thing has onboard Creative Audio PCI sound, an ES1373 chipset, which was actually an Ensoniq-based design. And then there's the low pin count I/O controller that says SMSC on it, Standard Microsystems Corporation, which was recently bought out. And then there is the Intel ICH2, probably Southbridge. Interestingly, this machine seems not to use the Intel integrated graphics that were so common at the time. There is a chip here with a heatsink on it that is very likely the graphics processor, and behind that you can see that there's actually some video RAM installed on this board just behind this ribbon cable. Hopefully I can get it to where you can see it a little bit better here. I know this camera's low light sensitivity gets pretty grainy pretty fast, but you should be able to make out the random access memory chips for use with the video system. I would hope that that's something like an ATI graphics processor, probably an early Rage series GPU. I will be rather less impressed if it's one of those chromatic research things. It's very rare that I have anything truly unkind to say about any particular vendor's integrated circuit products. But Chromatic Research produced the buggiest piece of crap video chipsets I have ever seen, and it is no wonder that they are not still in business today. The one thing I remember about them, in addition to how hard it was to find the drivers a couple years ago for Windows 2000 when I came across a similar vintage Gateway mid-tower machine like this that was running Windows 2000, was the fact that the VGA emulation was very unusual. The VGA capability almost seemed like maybe it was in fact being emulated in some sense. It had a very strange on-screen font, much different than the usual character font that most computers have. You know, it's practically a standard. I've only seen a very few computers that used a different character font or even let you choose which font you wanted to load. Although loadable fonts for basic graphics are much more common in places like Japan, where they have a much more complex character set than most of the rest of the world. But the chromatic research, the chromatic research chipset, in addition to having a very strange on-screen font, was just very, very slow in its base video modes. I don't know if there was some kind of a bug in the design or if it was doing some kind of oddball emulation. But we'll see what chipset this thing is, because we are going to power it up here in just a moment. A look at the drives that are in it. You can see the CDRW on top, the stock CD-ROM on the bottom, the floppy drive. The microprocessor is nestled behind those ribbon cables. You can just barely see it. And as proof that this was a simpler and less power-hungry time, it only has a heatsink on it, not an actual fan. I would imagine that the intake from the power supply fan, although there's several inches worth of space between the two, is meant to cool the microprocessor. So it might be best to go ahead and put the case cover back on this thing before I test it out. We have a Western Digital hard drive suspended upside down from the top of the machine. I have no idea what capacity that is, but I'd guess somewhere between 4 and 10 gigabytes, depending upon how well this machine is equipped. We have one DIMM. There are sockets for there's a socket for a second one, and that pretty much rounds out the internal hardware inside the computer. For a budget machine, this is an exceptionally well-built case. It's got some sharp edges on it. Also has a very curious artifact on the back. You can see there's a place to put a fan here. I've never seen one of these machines, no matter what processor it had, with the fan in place. But since I do have some extra fans laying around, like this one right here that came out of a defunct power supply, I might actually go ahead, now the fan belongs on the inside of the case, but I might actually go ahead and put a fan there just to give this machine a little bit of an easier time with ventilation. There's the information on the back, the serial number, the manufacturing date, and the complete model number. This is an FMN400C system. And rather amazingly, this thing is very clean inside. I was truly impressed. No blown capacitors, no dust all over everything, because a lot of these budget stature computers, and even some much more expensive ones, oftentimes ended up doing double duty as a vacuum cleaner. You would think that if you opened them up, you would think that someone had been using them as a household vacuum cleaner. But the only sign of that inside this machine is inside the power supply. You can see there's a fair bit of dust buildup in there, but the rest of everything is remarkably clean. And pretty soon, so too will be the power supply. I don't ordinarily buy these duster cans because they're very expensive and I don't think they're good value for money. Plus I can smell the bitterant crap that they put in them, and it just puts me on edge when I use them because I have a very sensitive sense of smell. But I'm also feeling too lazy to take this machine out to the garage and give it a proper blowing out with the air compressor. And given that my air compressor is a cast iron tanked beast, I'm not likely to drag it down here. I once carried it across the driveway in my own 2 arms and put it in the back of my pickup truck, and it was almost like doing the equivalent of putting my internal organs in a blender. That was not a very good idea. So sometimes these little duster cans are just the ticket. It really didn't make a huge difference to the amount of dust inside the power supply. I may have to take it apart if I want to do a proper job of cleaning it. But that should be good enough for starters. Certainly better than it was. So let me throw the case cover on it and we will power this thing up and see what it does and see if there's some use for that Windows product key. Presumably a Windows product key at least. Now here's something that I have to admit I find utterly mystifying. Go ahead, if you will, and take a look at the ports on the back of the computer and see if you can tell me what's wrong. Now the perspective isn't the best, so you might not be able to tell for sure, but if you've ever spent any time working on other people's computers, you've probably seen the problem that I'm about to explain. Go ahead and take a closer look at the blue video connector, and you might just be able to notice that the 2 retaining nuts for an attached monitor signal cable are backed out considerably. The other ports on this computer are still perfectly fine, probably because most of them, with the possible exception of the printer port, were not used. And of course, in the case of the mouse and keyboard ports, they don't have any retaining screws on them at all. They're just friction fits. I don't know what it is that possesses people when they're attaching a peripheral of some kind to a computer, that they think they have to tighten this down as though they were constructing a part of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I run across this problem often enough that, as you can see, I actually have a nut driver for this purpose. Now, some of these are a little bit bigger than this. Some of them are a little bit smaller, but this one comes pretty close to getting them all. It's not always perfect, and it doesn't fit these perfectly, but anything I can do to tighten these up will be an improvement. So we'll go ahead and just try to do that here. Hopefully they will actually tighten up. If you don't have an appropriate nut driver for this, you can just use something like a needle nose pliers. Sometimes you might be able to get a satisfactory result using your fingers. I might go ahead and tighten these up with a needle nose pliers because my nut driver, unfortunately, does not fit them very well, and it didn't get them very tight, and I really don't want them to back out again. So I might go ahead and revisit that at some point in the future. But enough of my yakking. It's time to get cracking on powering this thing up. So let's go ahead and attach some cables here. I won't screw in the monitor cable because it'll probably just pull those nuts out again, and we don't want that. We'll go ahead and hook up the keyboard here. As previously mentioned, although I did get the original mouse with this computer, it unfortunately was bereft of its ball. You know, there's a joke in there somewhere, I'm sure. Loose nuts and a missing ball. I can't believe I said that on video. Yeah, this is supposed to be a family-friendly channel, and there I go saying stuff like that. So here we go. We're going to plug in the power and see if anything goes boom or crack in an interesting manner. So it's time for the smoke test! Well, the keyboard lights blinked, but that's about all that happened. So nothing blew up. That's always a good sign. Let's get cracking on powering this thing up. This is definitely not the most appropriate choice of a monitor considering this computer's stature, but I suppose that there are people out there who back in the day bought one of the early and very expensive flat panel LCD displays to go with their inexpensive computer because they just couldn't have a CRT, or they thought that some part of their computer ought to look like it cost $1 million. Here we go. Power up time. A little bit of fan noise, not bad. Monitor's responding as though it has sync. Let's see if I got there in time to get into system setup, or if it's going to give me a keyboard error, or boot into Windows 98. It will be very interesting to see if this computer's disk was wiped, but given that it appears to be to have been unsafely shut down, I would imagine that the installation of Windows 98 on here is not fresh, or maybe someone was testing it out in the thrift store. It's hard to tell. We'll go ahead and see if it actually boots into Windows here. I'm sure that any of you who remember working with Windows 98 back in the day, as well as I do, can certainly remember when Windows 98 could be more than a little temperamental. And it looks like this is indeed not a fresh installation of Windows 98. So Bradley W. Campbell, wherever you are, I've apparently got your computer. We'll see if the password's blank, but I don't think so. Fortunately, Windows 98 has very high military government grade security. It's actually detecting my monitor. I don't believe it. Well, we're going to go ahead and cancel that because I don't feel like messing with it. Let's go ahead and see what we've got here. See how much RAM this computer's got in it. I'd guess 64 megabytes, but it could have 128. Definitely appears that the display driver has not been properly loaded because this looks like VGA only resolution and 16 color depth at the most to me. Holy cow, look at all those system tray icons. A lot of those come from the Corel WordPerfect desktop application director, but there are plenty of them if you don't count it. I could go ahead and see here. I could go ahead and close that down, and there'd still be a ton of the things sitting there. Virus scans, sound. I think that's no, that's sound as well. That's the Sound Blaster audio. Searching has a printer icon. Windows Guardian. Boy, does that sound reputable. And then we have the McAfee virus scan scheduler and a Heads NCD packet writing software. So some of the software is set up appropriately on this machine, but definitely not all of it. We go ahead and head into the device manager here, and it does look like we are missing a driver for the modem. It is ATI Rage Graphics. Boy, I called that one, didn't I? That's a sure sign that you've been doing this too long. Well, let's see if maybe we can get a little bit better color depth out of it or something. A little bit better resolution, color depth, maybe even both. Sometimes you have to pace yourself when you go to change Windows 98's graphics settings. If you try to do too much at once, like both the resolution and the color depth, the system will, to use a technical term, barf all over itself, and you will not be very happy. So go ahead and let Windows restart and see if it actually manages to come up with a decent picture that looks a little bit more presentable than plain old VGA. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about with display adapters under Windows 98. It could be that there's actually a problem with the display hardware or its driver, but under Windows 98, unless smoke is pouring out of the hardware and there are 6-foot flames, it's really very hard to tell what's going on. So let's be a little bit more conservative with our graphics settings and see if we can get it up to 8-bit color. And sure enough, being a little more conservative with our upgrade of the display settings worked perfectly. So let's go ahead and see if we can make the jump to high color now. One of the nice features that debuted for the first time in Windows 98 was the ability to change your display resolution and color depth settings without restarting, although as Microsoft aptly points out, some older programs would not take very kindly to that, and sometimes Windows would run one end of itself right up the other if you tried that. Like I say, it was definitely a different time, but I don't think I have to tell too many of you in the viewing audience that. So now that we're up to 16-bit color, we'll go ahead and see how far we can take the display resolution. And it looks like this thing can manage a 1280 by 1024 that would equal the native resolution of this Dell 17-inch flat panel display. So let's go ahead and try and see if that makes 6-foot flames shoot out of the graphics adapter. Nope, it looks to have worked, which is always nice. The desktop icons are not being auto-arranged, but it's the work of just a moment to fix that. I went ahead and looked at the hardware roster. It turns out I was wrong about the chipset that this thing had. This thing actually has an Intel 440 chipset in it, which was another choice that was very good if you did not want one of the various Rambus flavored products from Intel at the time, or an off-brand chipset if something about that happened to bother you. Intel wanted the 440 chipset to die so badly, but it refused to do so because there was still quite an enormous demand for it in the marketplace, despite the fact that it was getting very, very long in the tooth. So there's our display adapter, there's our disk drives. Of course, Windows 98 is not very specific about what they actually are. Now, one thing that you could do back in the days of Windows 98 that we all take for granted today, on better, higher performance chipsets, newer chipsets, you could choose to operate your hard drive or even your optical drives in direct memory access mode instead of programmed I/O, which let them do some work without involving a great deal of overhead from the central processing unit. And it would definitely make a difference on this system because I have noticed that as it boots up, the mouse pointer pauses for a moment as Windows thrashes itself to get ready for you to work with it or probably crash in short order. So this machine would definitely benefit from having the DMA option turned on, but when we do, Windows will tell us that it might have undesirable effects with our hardware. I never had a problem with it on any Intel chipset of the time, so we're going to live dangerously. It'll probably ask me to restart when I'm done, and the option is also available for the CD-ROM drives. Now, older CD-ROM drives could have a real problem with this if you asked them to run outside of programmed I/O mode. Some of them simply did not support it. And one of these drives is the original to the machine, the other is much newer. So I wouldn't be surprised if one of them on the cable ends up being able to do it and the other does not. But to know for sure, we'll have to end up rebooting the machine. Now we'll see how big the hard drive is in this thing. Just go ahead and take a quick look here. If the My Computer window will actually open, and boy did it ever open. I'll tell you what, this is the computer to have if size matters, because that is one big window for my computer. Of course, if they were running this thing at 640 by 480 with 16 colors, They probably wanted the window as big as they could make it. 8 GB hard drive, so I was about right on that. And let's see, we'll go over here to the Performance tab in Device Manager. And Windows tells us, at least as much as it possibly can be, that our system is configured for optimal performance. It'll be even better when we go ahead and reboot the system. Now here's a fun little trick that maybe some of you out there in the viewing audience did not know of. If you change your hardware settings in Windows 98 and Windows 98 says that you have to reboot, for some things it'll go ahead and do a quick boot. It just cycles back out to DOS and then cycles you back into Windows once again. But for most of the hardware related changes that you make, Windows 98 will actually force a full restart of the computer. Fortunately, one thing that you can do if you take the shutdown option on the start menu, wow, that's doing something interesting. I would imagine that the display is, although it automatically adjusted itself, it might be a little bit out of calibration with relation to the sync signals the video card is putting out, because that's pretty wild. Anyway, getting back to the subject here, if you choose the restart option, and watch this, I need like 3 hands to do this, but we're going to try to do it with just 2, because I don't know if anybody has 3 hands, not even Bizarre Furhead has that many. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, the left Shift key, though I'm not sure it makes a difference. My memory's a little fuzzy on the subject, and at the same time we're doing that, we'll hit the OK button, and instead of rebooting the whole computer, Windows will just go ahead and restart itself, which will shave just a couple of seconds off of the boot process. But I can't even begin to tell you how much we valued those couple of seconds back in the day. Or it was also possible that the computer would decide once again to ram one end of itself up the other and refuse to reboot properly. But it looks like maybe this system's going to do that. Yep, here we go. Here's the quick reboot. Windows is now restarting. So as you can see, it definitely did not restart the whole computer. I don't think we're going to take too much of a detailed look at the software on this machine. Most of it's not anything that's really very interesting. And out of respect for the previous owner's privacy, I feel bad enough having mentioned his name on the video, because I don't want anybody harassing this person just because I happen to buy their second-hand computer, and I certainly have no intention of trying to find out who they are or where they live or anything like that, because it's none of my business. We're certainly not going to go ahead and look at any of their documents here on video or otherwise. But now that we have rebooted Windows, you can see that some of the icons are showing up in true color. This was a feature that while Windows 3.1 actually supported high color icons back in the day, nobody ever used them, and few people ever ran Windows 3.1 on a 16-bit per pixel, 16-bit color display or better, so most people never knew that. And Microsoft got away with including that feature for the first time in the Windows 95 Plus add-on. I don't know too many people who ran Windows 95 without the Plus pack. Back then, Windows 95 Plus was pretty doggone good value for money, and in addition to adding silly little things like an enhanced set of icons and enabling high color icon support, it also included some greatly improved utilities such as Drive Space 3, which, back in the day, drive compression was something that for a lot of people really mattered, and was something that a lot of people got a lot of use out of. Back then, storage was not cheap for these machines. And so anything you could do to stave off having to buy a larger hard drive or anything along those lines was probably worth doing. In a lot of ways, it was a simpler time back then. Listen to how nostalgic I'm getting here. I've played with this computer for like 10 minutes so far after plugging the power cord in, and I'm just talking about it like some kind of a stupid person. I don't even know. It's pretty far out. But I got to go ahead and wrap this video up here, just to give you a quick look at this computer. I'm not sure what I'll end up doing with it. I will probably go ahead and reload Windows 98 from scratch on this the next time I get to feeling pretty nostalgic about Windows 98. So I would imagine, probably about 20 years from now. Because although Windows 95 and 98 were great for their time, I certainly had enough of them, and Windows NT flavored products first version of NT I used, I suspect like many other people, was NT 4.0 back in the day, and I can just remember that even though it had some rough edges compared to Windows 95 and 98, the stability was intoxicating. You know, this was the kind of stability that people on Unix and Linux boxes at the time talked about having, and all we Windows 95 and 98 users could do was dream about it. If you got through a whole day without Windows 95 or 98 crashing back in the day, you'll notice I haven't mentioned Windows Millennium here because I think it's very unlikely that it would stay up for the whole day. Anyway, you know, those were the times. We'll go ahead and go in here to the device manager real quick. I wanted to look at something in here and I forgot about it. I wanted to see if the DMA access setting on the various drives, both optical and fixed, stayed in place, and it did for the original Lucky Gold Star CD-ROM drive. We'll see if the CD burner maintained its setting, but given it's the newer of the two, I would certainly expect it to, and it did. Go down here and look at the hard drive. Nope, that's the floppy drive. What are you thinking, William? And the DMA setting stuck for that too. Well, like I said, out of respect for the previous owner's privacy, I'm not going to rifle through this computer. I'm certainly not going to do such a thing on video. So I thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative and not too terribly rambly. Meanwhile, thank you for watching, and by all means, feel free to leave a comment if you have one.